Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about life through the prism of food. And this week, as it's election week in the UK and France, I'm chatting to Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall about the best way to support the NHS.
With the exception maybe of the hawthorn leaves and oxeye daisy leaves, you could put them in. A few things like that, but, probably a good 70 or 80 of those plants are things that everyone would recognise as things that at one time or another they've had on their plate and are not that hard to access.
Last time we met to talk about the River Cottage's Good Comfort, his message was to swap out the less healthy ingredients for more, eating healthily not by taking stuff out, but by putting more in. This time he's upped his game and using the best of the latest science, he's showing us how to eat 30 different plants a week. I asked him, why 30?
30 plants a week is a really helpful way to think about eating healthily. And most importantly, it's also a really delicious way because plants are the most abundant providers of flavour and texture and excitement in our cooking. Even though we can get very excited and fixated about fish and meat, it's worth reminding people that plants really are where it's at. They are the great broad palette of delicious cooking. So that's first and foremost. I want people to be excited about eating plants, not to feel they're doing it just for the goodness of their bodies. However, there is some fantastic science that tells us that eating 30 plants a week is brilliant for our health. And one of the champions of that is Tim Spector, who I know you've talked to. Many people will have heard his podcasts and much of his brilliant thinking around food. And I'm delighted that Tim wrote an introduction to this book because it really does explain the science incredibly well. But to summarise it in my way, if you like, the study that was at the heart of this didn't set out to find out about how many plants a week we should be eating. It set out to look at whether vegans, omnivores or vegetarians were having significantly better outcomes than each other. And it followed over 11,000 people. They kept very detailed food diaries during the time of the study. And then the study looked into their gut microbiomes and some of their medium to long-term health outcomes. And bizarrely, or perhaps not surprisingly in the end, it actually didn't find any significant differences between those self-identified diets of omnivore, veggie and vegan. But when they looked into the food diaries and particularly started looking at the amount of plants they were eating, that was when the pattern emerged. So whether or not you were omnivore, veggie or vegan, if you were eating more plants, you had better outcomes. It was as simple as that. The number 30 came because a small but significant number of people on the study were already eating 30 plants a week, and they had great, really nice, diverse, healthy gut microbiomes and really good long-term health outcomes. So the study said, well, if we could all eat a few more plants and maybe get close to 30, that would be a great way for everyone to go, regardless of whether they were identifying as vegan, veggie or whatever. And also, the benefits go up quite directly, quite steeply, the more plants you eat, up to 30, and they continue to rise, but they plateau off a little bit. So 30 is, 28 is great, 32 is great, but, we've gone for 30, and this number's been knocking around for a couple of years now. So it isn't my idea. My idea was to create a cookbook that makes that number of plants really accessible, really good fun, really achievable, not too expensive, etc., etc. So that's what I've tried to do in How to Eat 30 Plants a Week.
And it's interesting, I get my desk is full of books on vegetables, it's full of books on diet, on science, on all sorts of things. I'm interviewing Chris Van Tullochen next. I get a lot of these books across my desk. But this one has really changed the way I look at my food, and I've been doing food for a very, very long time.
Gilly, coming from you, that's an amazing thing to hear coming from you.
Well, I'll tell you why. So I thought, 30, God, that's a lot. And then I realised, actually, it's really not. I eat about 15 every single meal, and the point is that they have to be different vegetables. So I am actively choosing to eat different vegetables in every meal. But my husband, who's not such a food fan as I am, he tends to eat beige food. We went to this rather lovely restaurant last week, and he was eating his fish and chips, and on his plate had a lovely salad with all sorts of gorgeous stuff in it. And he said, it's impossible to eat 30 different plants. And I said, in that salad, count how many there are including the seeds.
Yeah.
And the nuts.
Totally.
And the spices.
Absolutely.
Now, he counted 8.
Great.
On that plate.
Great. And your dog is just woofing, saying, count me in for this. Can you get 30 plants into my bowl every day, please?
Do you know what? The dogs are actually on insects. But
Great.
That is the point, isn't it? Very quickly, the amount goes up, doesn't it? And it's easy.
It is. I mean, I tend to talk about plants just because it reminds people that vegetables, people often think, you want me to eat 30 fresh vegetables or fruits every day? And actually, the store cupboard is a really important part of this story. Fresh fruit and vegetables, fantastic. Obviously, we should get lots of that in. But the store cupboard, which often we think of as being there for standby ingredients, but actually they can be part of our everyday meals in a really brilliant way. And you're absolutely right. Probably the area where most of us have room for improvement is with things like nuts, seeds, pulses, and the spices. And I think a lot of us have got these things in our cupboard, but they just sit there gathering dust. I've got much better at cracking open a tin of beans, not in tomato sauce, just a regular tin of butter beans or kidney beans. And whenever I'm cooking, I'm thinking, well, should I whack a tin of beans into this? Or a handful of frozen peas? It's not just about kind of expensive fresh fruit and vegetables. A lot of it's about the stuff that is very relatable, very achievable. Frozen vegetables, I've done a few, what I hope are handy lists in the books. Half a dozen really useful frozen veg, half a dozen really useful tinned vegetables, tomatoes, beans, chickpeas, that kind of stuff. They all play a part.
Yes, and those lists are really important, actually, because you go through them and you go, oh, yeah, oh, of course. That's easy. Of course, I've got that in my store cupboard right now. And that's the point, isn't it? The different plants is also really important. I remember when I first interviewed Tim Spector way back, actually, before he was doing Zoe and all this stuff. I said, what is it? What does it all drill down to? And he said it's about exciting your gut, which is exactly what you're talking about. And that's what he said. It's about keeping it guessing. So eat widely.
That's a really, really good way of putting it. And of course, from a cook's point of view, I would come right alongside that and say, if you're exciting your gut, there's no reason why you can't be massively exciting your palate at the same time, because more spice, more different vegetables. If you've got a few neat recipes that bring them all together, that's just more deliciousness on a daily basis. So that is, to use a very well-worn phrase these days, it's a win-win, right? So who wouldn't want to do that? And you mentioned spice, and I'll just dwell on that for a minute or two, because it's such an interesting area. We've everyone who likes to cook has got spices in their cupboard, but they often start to languish at the back of the shelf and they gather dust and we don't pull them out. Unless we're thinking, I'm going to cook a curry. But actually, there are great ways of, a sprinkling of whole caraway seeds on brassicas is delicious. And you can be quite generous with them in that context. Even rubbing a few coriander seeds into the crackling of your roast pork, And I particularly like to encourage people to use these whole seed spices, coriander, cumin, and caraway being 3 that I use a lot, but also obviously chili. And things like that are really nice. But these more aromatic whole seed spices, one thing that I like to remind people is, more often than not, they're alive. These are seeds first and foremost, and they happen to have a nice spicy flavour. A lot of them, if you chuck them in the ground, they will grow. The coriander seeds in your cupboard are very likely to be viable seeds. Now, I was at my parents' house not long ago. My mum's a great cook, but I did do a little rationalisation of her cupboard, and I found some jars of spices from the last century, like a little box of ground mace wrapped up with a plastic kind of rolled up and shoved back down into the little cardboard packet. I don't think it'd been opened since the previous century. It was half used. Extraordinarily, it still had quite a pleasing mace-like smell. So it just goes to show that they do endure spices. And don't worry too much if you've got a few that are past their sell-by date. Just crack through and use them up, and then go out and get some more. And have them handy. Get them out on the worktop where you can see them. And I've tried to include lots of fun spices in my recipes in the book, not just for curries, but for just generally giving lots of planty dishes a nice boost. And it's a great way to cook. And one of the other studies that Tim mentions is where the only difference in people's diets was that they had a spoonful of mixed spice in their cooking every day. And they weren't asked to make any other changes at all. And even that had a beneficial long-term effect on the diversity of their gut microbiome. So even these small quantities of aromatics, spices, herbs, that we're not asking people to use them in a sort of a ridiculous way to put tablespoons full of, they will have an effect even in the way that we use them anyway, for their punchy flavour and for giving a little lift to dishes that we like.
And exciting the gut. And it's stimulation, isn't it? And that's what it's all about.
That's it.
So take
Absolutely.
some leftover vegetables from the back of the fridge, toast them with some spices, and you've got a really fabulous stimulating dish for your gut and getting rid of waste.
Yeah. One of the dishes, there are some nice leftover dishes in the book. One of them I call double and squeak, because it's like, what have you got to put in there along with the cabbage and the onion and the mashed potato? Double the veg, add a few spices. There's a lovely curried variation on that. And yeah, once you get into the habit of it, and so I've included these categories, and the end papers, the inside back cover and the inside front cover I've got my list with little tick boxes of the different plants, and some people seem to be really enjoying that. Some people like to just freestyle it. They don't need to actually count. They just need to have it in their minds that they are going to whack in a load more plants and build up the plant repertoire in their cooking, and that's great. Others really like to tick those boxes and get to the numbers, like, I got to 36 this week, I got to 45 this week. It feels good. You're getting past that 30 every week, and that's a good feeling.
I'm really enjoying telling other people to count, because everyone says 30, God, that's a lot, and then I get them to count it. So although I'm not actually counting myself for my own meals, I'm passing it on, and everyone responds in exactly the same way. It's great. Let's go to your food moments. Gooseberry gazpacho. So tell me about this one. Why did you choose this one?
Well, I love your invitation, Gilly, to look through the book that you've just written, and then what are the recipes that jump out as having real kind of history and depth behind them? Because I didn't necessarily think about it while I was putting it together. I've created lots of fun gazpacho recipes, but actually I now remember that gazpacho for me goes back to a holiday in the early 70s. My dad was in advertising, and one of the accounts he had was for a package holiday firm that did holidays on the Costa del Sol. So he got a free holiday for the family, and we were all packed off to Marbella, to a nice sort of 4-star hotel. It wasn't like top, but it was really, really fun and lovely. And I thought it was super exciting. I was a fussy kid when it came to food in my youth. There were so many things I didn't eat. And funnily enough, one of them was tomatoes. You couldn't get me near an actual tomato, but I did like ketchup. And then when I was in Spain, on the buffet in the hotel every evening was this massive pot of iced gazpacho. And my mum just told me, it tastes just like ketchup. And I was a bit sceptical about that. But anyway, I ladled some into my bowl, and I did really like it. And I think that was my transition towards actual tomatoes. Like, it was tangy, it was zesty, it was fresh. It had this, you could put some croutons in it, which was nice, but also some cubes of cucumber, a few little things you could garnish your gazpacho with. And I had it every night for the whole of the holiday, and I've enjoyed gazpacho ever since. So lots of variations on the gazpacho theme. And of course, there's lots of ways to add fun plants to it. At the moment, right now, I'm waiting for the first tomatoes to ripen in my greenhouse. There'll be another week or two, but I've got abundant crops of gooseberries. And for a couple of years now, I've done this variation of a gooseberry gazpacho. Sounds a bit out there, but if you think about it, the qualities of gooseberries are not that different from, there's acidity, there's fruitiness, there's aromatics. And gooseberry's always been a useful fruit for combining in savoury ways. As you know, Gilly, it makes a great accompaniment to fish, particularly rich fish like mackerel. But a gooseberry gazpacho really, really works. And I make it creamy with a few beans. You can use butter beans, a tin of butter beans, or if you've got broad beans in the garden or that you can buy in the farmer's market, that's a great combination. That bittersweet bean or a creamy bean with the tanginess of the gooseberry, a little bit of garlic, onion, cucumber. You can even put some lettuce in there and whiz it all up. It's a great summer explosion of flavours in a chilled, zesty soup. So I'm going to go on eating gazpacho in varying fun forms till the end of time. What a great dish.
I just love that. You know, I saw you at Charleston recently with B. Wilson, and you were talking about how our ancestors used to sit around telling stories about food, because actually they didn't have very much else to talk about. You know, what they'd done in the day was pretty much forage. And, you know, that idea of looking around your garden and thinking, what else? You know, now that we know we've got to ramp up the plants, what else? Oh, hang on a second, that would go with that. You know, it makes you think sideways in a way that I haven't really come across before. You know, there's the flavour pairing books. There's all these kind of books that are really fascinating, but I probably don't use them very much. But actually now I'm thinking, I am healthy and I want to continue being healthy. So buy in some more plants.
Yeah, I mean, those of us who grow our own veg, of course, we're super lucky to be able to, you know, pick new things every day. And we're getting to that point of the summer where everything's coming on really in a super exciting way. I was also at the Hay Festival on stage with Tim, and I pulled a bit of a fast one on him because people often ask, so how many plants have you had today, Hugh, or this week, Hugh? So I did a tour of the veg patch that morning, and picked and nibbled almost every edible thing I could see, including some little young hawthorn leaves and things like that. And poor Tim had just got off a Ryanair flight from Spain and got into the theatre a couple of minutes late. And sure enough, someone asked, I want to ask you both how many plants you've had today. And Tim said, how many? Tim said, well, I've been travelling all day and I haven't really hardly even eaten, so I'm afraid not very many. And he said, and how many have you had, Hugh? And I said, oh, I've had 109. Which is not the object of the exercise. I was just doing it for a bit of fun. I mean, that's probably the most number of plants I've ever had in a single day. Because not only did I go around the whole of the vegetable garden, I went round the kitchen cupboard and ate every single little seed, anything I could find in the fridge, just like nibble this, taste that. And then on the train to Hay, I went through my own plant list in my book. I had no idea how many I'd eaten until I started ticking them off, and I got past 100. I thought, that's insane.
Brilliant.
But also none of those actually, with the exception maybe of, you know, the hawthorn leaves and one or two things in the garden, oxeye daisy leaves, you know, you could put them in, a few things like that. But, you know, probably a good 70 or 80 of those plants are things that everyone would recognise as things that at one time or another they've had on their plate and are not that hard to access.
Exactly. But, I mean, I was thinking of nettles, and I was thinking of, you know, self-seeding fennel I've got. There's all sorts of stuff in the garden that if you actually do look, you don't need to. I'm a terrible gardener. But, you know, there are masses of things that I can eat. What I love about a lot of the recipes is, you know, you add a load of herbs, different herbs to salads.
Yeah. Which don't have to be, you know, one of the things I always try and put in my recipes is suggestions for variations. There are very few recipes in the world that you need to stick to the exact recipe to get a good result. So I'm very easy about freewheeling alternatives. If you haven't got this, try a bit of that. And people should get the hang of that very quickly.
Yeah, and it is about getting the hang of it. Purple panzanella is your second food moment. This takes us back to the River Cafe back in 1989, one of your very first jobs. Tell us about why you chose this one.
Well, the River Cafe was completely transformative for me. I had no formal training, but they were good enough to give me a chance in the kitchen. And I was there for almost 6 months before, as some people have heard before, I got fired because I didn't quite have the necessary discipline to keep my station tidy, and things were... There were too many cooks in the kitchen, blah-de-blah. Anyway, I was devastated at the time, but I still look back on those 6 months as utterly transformative and brilliant. And obviously wonderful fish and meat, but huge respect for vegetables and plant ingredients, including tinned beans and tinned tomatoes, like, you know, which made important dishes like Papa Pomodoro. But the panzanella was brilliant. You know, they had really good sourdough bread. Once the tomatoes got into season, they were part of the menu every single day. But putting those two things together, stale bread and tomatoes, and then building up lots of lovely things, very thinly sliced onions, olives, basil, And since it's also, a panzanella is also an invitation to improvise, as we've just been discussing, all those lovely variations. So I love putting beetroot. If it's very tiny, baby, sort of golf ball or smaller, freshly grated beetroot, makes everything turn purple. Later in the summer, you probably want to cook them because they can get a bit too earthy or a slightly tannic note, but that cooks out very nicely. And then either very thinly sliced or again grated. And you toss that up again with tomatoes. And as you get later into the summer, you can add things like plums. Again, just as I was discussing the gooseberry gazpacho, plums in a panzanella, not instead of tomatoes necessarily, but alongside them. There's that fun thing where you're playing with different... a tomato is a fruit. It's almost random that we've chosen to consider tomatoes in a savoury way and plums in a sort of sweet way, but they actually go together really brilliantly. Californians have been very good at sort of mixing around things like peaches, watermelon, plums, tomatoes in really colourful dishes. I think we've been a little bit slow to embrace this lovely mix-up of fruits and vegetables on the same plate. But panzanella is a very good platform to have a bit of fun with that. So my purple panzanella is what my latest variation on that theme. And again, takes me back to those amazing days at the River Cafe.
Yeah, and that kind of combination, that equation of, food memory, bit of European inspiration, and just adding more health has become a bit of a signature Hugh, hasn't it?
For sure.
And your third food moment is exactly that. So, kedgeree, it's called barley kedgerotto. Kedgeree came from your mum. You then add loads of really interesting stuff to it, and you bring out something that we could all just go, oh, yeah. Tell us about this one.
Well, I've always loved kedgeree, and my mum's was the most simple version of it. Smoked fish, white rice and hard-boiled eggs, maybe a sprinkling of parsley on top. And actually, because it's an Anglo-Indian dish, I would often use curry spices and maybe a sprinkling of raisins and some more fresh herbs. But this time I've gone for a more local, close-to-home grain, barley, which I always think cooks out better if you make it a little bit creamy. So it's a slightly more saucy variation, and lots of lovely fresh herbs, plus the smoked fish. It's actually a breakfast dish we do at the River Cottage Kitchen and Store at our cookery school here in Devon, where we're probably likely to put a bit of curry spice in there as well. But on this occasion, I've just gone big on the fresh herbs, plus onions, spring onions, chives, garlic, lots of alliums, which gives it a nice kick to it. And it's a creamy, comforting, smoky version. Somewhere between a kedgeree and a risotto, hence the barley kedgerotto, just to bring it all in. I do love a bit of a mash-up when it comes to naming my dishes.
An easy midweek dinner as well.
For sure.
Multi-fruit, multi-grain crumble. You did a crumble in Comfort Food, again, using wholemeal flour, just to add that extra kind of element of health. This goes even further. But again, food memory goes back to your granny. Yeah,
so my granny and then my mum have always made wonderful crumbles, pretty old school, popping them in the oven with the raw crumble mix on top and getting it crisping up, and then having that slightly gluey bit at the bottom of the crumble where it interfaces with the fruit. That's still great. I often make my crumble independently now. So it's a little bit like making a granola. You put the whole crumble mix in a tray, just clumped up a little bit with your hands to make sure you've got those crunchy lumps, and bake that off with maybe a couple of stirs halfway through. And that method lends itself very well to adding extra ingredients that don't just make it more wholesome, they really do make it more delicious. And probably oats and ground almonds were the things I would say put in every crumble, a handful of oats and a handful of ground almonds, because they make it more crumbly and more delicious. And then you can also add whatever seeds you've got. Don't go too crazy. You're not making a granola. It's still a crumble. But again, a few sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, chia seeds, just a handful or a spoonful of each adds texture and a nice nuttiness to the crumble. And you bake it off independently, and then you can sprinkle it on anything. So you can have a summer crumble with lovely macerated berries, strawberries at the moment. Basically, it's strawberries and cream with a crumble topping, or mash them together to make like a fool. Crumble on top of a fool. It's got to be a fumble, hasn't it, Gilly? So we love a bit of a fumble, especially in the summer.
Now, Hugh, you and I are talking a week before it's time to vote for the next government, and you and I have spent a lot of time campaigning for a better food system.
Totally.
What I love about this particular book and this whole idea of 30 different plants is it snaps you out of that robotic way of eating. It makes you think. It makes you look around the garden. It makes you look in your fridge. It makes you look in your store cupboard and say, OK, what can I do with this? How can I add more? What are you looking for from the next government in terms of getting us to eat more healthily?
Well, 30 Plants is a book for cooks who enjoy cooking and taking control of the way they eat. I would love a government to be informed by the fundamental principles of the book, is that we all need more diversity. You can actually boil it down almost to one thing in terms of the crisis. The obesity crisis that you and I have been campaigning about is in one respect, it's a fibre crisis. People are not getting enough variety and enough fibre. And government needs to learn to crawl before it can walk or run. And so far, we've had almost nothing in the last 15 years. When the problems presented to them as urgent, you get a few noises about, well, we'll trial this or we'll talk about that. But in terms of concrete policies, we've seen so little. So the first thing I want from a new government is, please take food seriously. Please take this. In fact, let's dispense with the please. It's more urgent than that. Take this seriously. We've got to help people find healthier food. Diseases related to diet are the single biggest cause of premature death and end-of-life issues that really make life hard for people. Type 2 diabetes is obviously right at the heart of that, but other things like heart disease play a part as well. This can be changed if people find healthier food. And it is part of the government's business, we believe, to help that to happen. You can't have a kind of total derogation of responsibility saying, we won't interfere with people's lives. We're not going to tell people how to eat. When the whole of the food industry is bombarding people with messaging and products that basically make ultra-processed foods, that basically are making them ill, then we do need government intervention. It is not inappropriate for the government to get involved in the national diet and pull some levers and come up with some policies that will really make a difference. So I need to see that acknowledged in the first days of Parliament, not as a nice to have, not as a sort of bolt-on extra, not when we've all been shouting in their ears for another year, but right from the get-go.
Actually, I've just been editing Anna Taylor, Executive Director of the Food Foundation, who you know very well, this morning, and she's looking through all the different manifestos and looking for this food strategy, and she spots a YouGov poll of all the parties' policy commitments, and it says that of the 10 Labour policies that the public were polled on, their commitment to ban the sale of energy drinks to under 16s was the most highly favoured of all Labour's policy commitments. And what's interesting about that, she says, it's one of the areas that is judged to be a nanny state intervention and therefore not one that garners public support. But this shows the contrary is the case. People recognise the importance of these policies to protect children's health. That means, yes, we want the government to do something. And just going back to Tim Spector's introduction and, the science behind the 30 plus plants, it helps to reduce the risk of common diseases, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, dementia, depression, autoimmune diseases and allergies. Imagine if we had a more productive workforce. That's what we mean, isn't it, by fixing the broken food system?
Yeah, absolutely. What Anna and many, many others have done so brilliantly, there's now the Obesity Alliance is more than 50 different NGOs and agencies, and there's massive consensus amongst them that there are a lot of levers we need to pull. We need to stop kids being bombarded with junk food advertising. We need to make it easier for everyone to access more fresh fruit and vegetables and whole plant foods generally. We need to get people away from ultra-processed foods. We need to get more fibre into people's diets. And there's a whole raft of policy levers that governments could be pulling that you and I have talked about in the past, have been identified. And we've got to not just pull one or two, got to pull them all because it's so urgent. This has to happen. And if it does, this is the thing that really could save the NHS. You know, yes, we need to spend more money on the NHS, but we also need to make sure that the next generation grows up understanding what healthy food is and how to take better care of themselves through the way that they eat. And then we can think of a time when actually the NHS will be there to help us when we're ill, but that fewer of us will be ill because we'll be looking after ourselves better with the primary source of healthcare, which is the food that we eat.
Thanks for listening. Head over to my Substack for extra bites of Hugh and a recipe from the book. And I'll see you next week.